Being a private investigator isn't as glamorous as people think. Sure, you get to snoop around, follow cheating spouses, dig up dirt on shady business deals. But every now and then, you stumble onto something much darker. Something you wish you had never discovered. It all started a few months ago when a new client approached me. He was a tall, nervous man in his early 50s, constantly looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be watching him. His name was Harold Mercer, and he was scared. "I need your help," he whispered as he sat down in my office, his hands trembling. "It's my daughter. She's gone missing, but there's more to it. The government is involved. They took her." I raised an eyebrow. "The government? What makes you think that?" Harold's eyes darted to the door as if someone might burst in at any moment. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a barely audible whisper. "She worked at a research facility. A secret one. Out in the desert. They were experimenting on things that shouldn't exist. And now, she's gone. I know they're covering it up. I've heard my share of conspiracy theories, but something about Harold's fear seemed genuine. He handed me a file, a collection of notes, documents, and blurry photographs of his daughter, Susan Mercer, and what appeared to be a government facility in the middle of nowhere. I decided to take the case. It took me a week to track down the location of the facility. It wasn't on any map, and even satellite imagery seemed to blur out the area like someone had deliberately erased it. But after piecing together clues from Harold's documents, I found it was deep in the desert, surrounded by nothing but sand and rocky cliffs. The facility was massive, an array of warehouses, laboratories, and what looked like bunkers, all surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Getting in wasn't easy, but I've had practice with these things. A few hours after sundown, I found a weak spot in the fence, cut my way through, and slipped into the compound unnoticed. It was eerily quiet. No guards, no alarms. Just the faint hum of generators somewhere deep within the facility. I moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as I approached the main building. As I crept through the corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The air was thick, suffocating. The silence oppressive. I found a room marked Experimentation Lab 4. My gut told me this was it, the place where Susan had been working before she vanished. I picked the lock and slipped inside. The lab was like something out of a nightmare. Glass tubes filled with murky liquid lined the walls, each containing things. Not human, not animal, but somewhere in between. Misshapen figures floated lifelessly in the tanks, their skin pale and translucent, their eyes, where there were eyes, staring blankly into the void. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. What the hell had they been doing here? On a nearby table, I found a stack of documents. They detailed the experiments being conducted, genetic manipulation, attempts to fuse human DNA with something else. Alien, perhaps. Or something older, something from deep within the earth. The words, Project Nexus, were scrawled across the top of each page, but that wasn't the worst part. The bottom of the stack was a folder marked Subjects. Inside were photos and detailed profiles of the people they had experimented on. And there, among them, was Susan Mercer. The photo showed her strapped to a table, her eyes wide with terror. She looked gaunt, pale, and there was something wrong about her face. Her skin seemed to be stretching, twisting. I flipped through the rest of the file. It detailed the progress of the experiments. It mentioned that Susan had shown remarkable adaptability to the treatments and that her transformation was nearly complete. I felt sick to my stomach. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a faint clicking sound coming from the hallway. I quickly shoved the documents into my bag and turned off my flashlight, pressing myself against the wall. The clicking grew louder, closer. It wasn't footsteps. It was something else, something unnatural. A chill ran down my spine as I peered through the crack in the door. A figure emerged from the darkness, hunched over, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over its frame, and its face, it was Susan. Or what had once been Susan. Her eyes were hollow, sunken deep into her skull, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. But it was her. I recognized her from the photos. She moved slowly, methodically, her head twitching slightly with each step. That clicking sound came from her fingers, elongated, bony claws that tapped rhythmically against the walls as she moved, and I held my breath, praying she wouldn't come into the room. For a moment, she stopped just outside the door, sniffing the air like an animal. My heart pounded in my chest. I gripped the handle of my knife, ready for the worst. Then, without warning, she let out a low, guttural growl and slithered further down the hall, disappearing into the shadows. That I waited for what felt like an eternity before I dared to move. That I knew I couldn't stay any longer. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't Susan anymore. They had turned her into something else, something monstrous. And there were more like her. I could feel them. The air was thick with their presence, lurking just beyond the walls. That I made my way back to the fence, my pulse racing. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe around me, and I could hear the faint clicking of claws on concrete, growing louder, closer. Just as I reached the weak spot in the fence, I heard a voice. A soft, distorted whisper that sent shivers down my spine. That I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew what was behind me. I slipped through the fence and ran into the night, the sound of clicking claws chasing me all the way to my car. That I handed Harold the documents, but I didn't tell him what I saw. There was no point. The daughter he wanted to find was gone. Whatever was left of her was no longer human. A few days later, Harold disappeared. I wasn't surprised. The government, or whatever was running that facility, wasn't going to let anyone involved stay alive. I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for me, too. That I burned the documents, but it doesn't matter. The knowledge is out there. The experiments continue, buried deep in the desert, hidden from the world. And those things, those abominations, they're still out there, waiting. That I don't know how long I have before they find me. Maybe they already have. Maybe that shadow I see out of the corner of my eye isn't just my imagination. But one thing is certain, there are things the government is hiding, things far worse than anyone could ever imagine. And I wish I had never uncovered the truth, because once you know, there's no going back. I spent days after the encounter in a state of restless paranoia, always checking my surroundings, convinced that every shadow was something, or someone, sent to silence me. My mind replayed the horrific image of Susan's twisted form creeping through the halls of that lab. I knew they wouldn't just let me walk away. I had uncovered too much. The phone calls started soon after. They would ring once, just enough for me to notice, then go silent. At first, I thought it was a glitch, but when I picked up the phone on the third ring, I heard it. Breathing. Slow and deliberate, like someone standing inches away, listening, waiting. I hung up immediately, but the feeling that they were watching me never left. That I had burned the documents from Harold's file, thinking it would erase the danger. But the nightmares continued. Images of those glass tubes, the grotesque shapes floating inside, and Susan's distorted face haunted me each night. My mind kept drifting back to one word, Nexus. What did it mean? I knew the government wouldn't let me rest until they made sure I wasn't a threat. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't just leave it at that. Not anymore. There was something more sinister at play, something bigger than I could imagine, and the only way to survive was to expose it before they could stop me. That I spent weeks poring over every scrap of information I could find. I went through back channels, old contacts, and sources who owed me favors. Most of them turned me away when they heard I was digging into Nexus. Even those who didn't know what it was grew uneasy when I mentioned it. One night, I was sitting in my apartment, half drunk from trying to quiet the storm in my mind, when I received an email. No subject line, no sender. Just a link to a private chat room and a simple message, "You're not alone. They know." Against my better judgment, I clicked the link. The chat room was almost empty, save for one user, Watcher01, "Who are you?" I typed, my hands shaking. The reply came almost instantly. "Someone who knows what you saw. And what they're doing." My blood ran cold. Whoever this was, they knew about the facility. I hesitated before typing again. What is Nexus? There was a long pause before the answer came. It's not a place. It's a doorway. A connection to something other. I blinked, not fully understanding. Other? What does that mean? You saw it. The things in the tanks. They aren't from here. They're from outside. The government has been making contact for years, but they've gone too far. They're bringing things into our world. And they can't control them. I felt my stomach churn. The memory of those inhuman shapes in the tanks flashed in my mind. What happened to Susan Mercer? I asked, my pulse racing. The response came slower this time. She was changed. Nexus alters anyone who comes into contact with it. She was one of the first to undergo the process. But there are others. Many others. Suddenly, a new message appeared. They know where you are. They're coming for you. I shot up from my chair, heart pounding. I grabbed the essentials, wallet, phone, gun, and bolted for the door. As I stepped into the hallway, the air felt thick with an oppressive silence. My instinct screamed at me to run. I rushed down the stairs, not daring to take the elevator. Just as I reached the ground floor, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy boots approaching from the front entrance. Whoever they were, they had already made it inside. I slipped out through the service exit in the alley, the cold night air biting at my skin. That I made it to my car and peeled out of the parking lot, glancing in the rearview mirror to see two dark, unmarked SUVs pull up to my building. They were close. Too close that I drove aimlessly for hours, not knowing where to go, my mind racing. No matter where I went, I knew they'd find me. I had to figure out my next move before they caught up. The words from the chat room echoed in my head. It's not a place. It's a doorway. Nexus was more than just a facility. It was something far worse. And whatever the government was doing, it was out of control. That I ended up in a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of a sleepy town. The kind of place no one asks questions. I checked in under a fake name, hoping it would buy me some time. That night, I had another nightmare, but this one felt different. More vivid, more real. I was back in the facility, standing in the lab. The tanks were there, but they were no longer filled with murky liquid. Instead, they were empty, shattered. The creatures inside were gone. I could hear their claws scraping along the walls, moving closer. That I in the center of the room stood Susan, or what was left of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead of words, a distorted, otherworldly sound escaped. It wasn't human. It was something ancient, something that didn't belong here. That I jolted awake, covered in sweat. My phone was ringing. That I stared at it for a moment, dread creeping up my spine. The screen showed an unknown number, but I knew who it was. I answered. A familiar voice, calm and cold, came through the speaker. Asterisk asterisk, you can't run forever. We need you to stop. It was the government, or whatever entity was hunting me. They didn't just want to silence me, they wanted my help. I had uncovered too much, and now I was part of their twisted game. Asterisk asterisk, what do you want? I asked, my voice shaking. There was a pause, then the voice replied, asterisk asterisk, come back to the facility. We need you to finish what you started. Nexus is unstable, and only you can help us contain it. If you don't, it will spread. I sat there, paralyzed by fear. They were asking me to return to the place where it all started, the facility, the experiments, the horrors. But what scared me more than their demand was the implication that if I didn't act, whatever was lurking behind Nexus would break through, and the world would face something far worse. That I had no choice. They had me cornered, but deep down, I knew the truth. They weren't just trying to contain Nexus. They were experimenting with it, pushing the boundaries of what should never be tampered with. If I returned, there was a high chance I wouldn't survive. Worse, I might become one of those twisted creatures like Susan. That I packed my things, preparing for what felt like my final journey. My only hope was to destroy Nexus before it could destroy me, and possibly the world that I drove back to the desert, my heart heavy with dread. The drive to the facility was eerily silent. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A feeling of impending doom gnawed at my gut. I wasn't sure if this was a trap or if the government truly needed my help. But one thing was clear, Nexus was more than an experiment. It was a doorway to something far beyond human control. That I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the black SUVs again, but the road behind me was empty. They didn't need to chase me anymore. I was going back willingly. By the time I reached the facility, the sun had set, casting long, eerie shadows over the barren landscape. The place looked even more desolate than before. There were no guards, no lights, just a foreboding silence. That I parked my car at a distance, approaching on foot. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The air around the facility seemed thicker, almost like it was vibrating with a low hum. The air felt wrong, as if reality itself was fraying at the edges. That I made my way through the same weak spot in the fence, slipping inside undetected. The facility looked abandoned, but I knew better. Something was still lurking inside, and whatever it was waiting for me. I retraced my steps from my last visit, down the same corridors that had haunted my nightmares. The place reeked of chemicals and decay. The shattered tanks, the grotesque experiments, they were still there, but something had changed. The glass was cracked, splintered from the inside, as if the creatures had broken free. And then I heard it again, that same clicking sound, faint but growing louder. The same sound I had heard before when I'd first encountered Susan, or what she had become. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to keep moving. That I reached Experimentation Lab 4, the place where I had found Susan's file. The door was slightly ajar, a thin beam of light seeping through the crack. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. Inside, the lab had been transformed. The walls were covered in strange, pulsing symbols, runes that seemed to shift and writhe as I looked at them. In the center of the room stood a large, glowing structure, a machine of some kind, connected to wires and tubes that snaked across the floor like living things. And then I saw her. Susan, or what was left of her, was strapped to a table in the corner of the room, her body twisted and contorted beyond recognition. Her eyes, once full of fear, were now hollow, black voids. She was still alive, but barely. The transformation was nearly complete. That I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "Susan," I whispered, though I knew the thing on the table wasn't her anymore. Her head twitched toward me, and for a moment, her mouth opened as if she was trying to speak. But instead of words, that same guttural, inhuman growl escaped her lips. "She's beyond saving." I turned sharply. A man was standing in the doorway, tall, dressed in a crisp, black suit. His face was pale, expressionless. He didn't look like a scientist or a soldier. He looked wrong, like something that didn't belong in this world. "Who are you?" I asked, gripping my knife instinctively. The man stepped into the room, his eyes cold and calculating. "I'm here to make sure you finish the job." I took a step back, my mind racing. What job? What the hell is going on here? The man didn't blink. "Nexus is a doorway. A portal between worlds. Your government opened it, thinking they could control what came through. They were wrong." He gestured toward Susan. "The things they've been experimenting on, they're not from this world. They're from somewhere darker. The doorway is unstable. It's growing. And soon, it will break wide open." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you want from me?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You've seen too much. You're connected to Nexus now, whether you like it or not. The only way to stop it is from the inside. You have to close the doorway." I shook my head. "I'm not a scientist. I don't know how to, ***, he cut me off. "You don't need to be. You're here because Nexus has chosen you. It's not just a doorway, it's a living thing. It feeds on fear, on chaos. And it's been feeding on you since you first set foot in this place. I felt my blood run cold. Everything I had experienced, the nightmares, the paranoia, it all made sense now. Nexus wasn't just an experiment. It was alive, and it had been toying with me from the beginning. The man pointed to the glowing structure in the center of the room. That's the gateway. You need to go through it and shut it down from the other side. If you don't, this world will be consumed. I stared at the machine, the pulsing symbols on the walls seeming to crawl toward me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I knew I couldn't. I had come too far, uncovered too much. There was no escaping Nexus, ***, what happens if I don't come back? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The man's smile widened. Then this world is lost. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the machine. The air around it buzzed with energy, and as I got closer, I could feel something pulling at me, tugging at the edges of my mind. The machine whirred to life, the runes on the walls glowing brighter, and then I saw it. The portal that it was a swirling mass of darkness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. Tendrils of black smoke snaked out from the center, reaching for me, beckoning me to step inside. ***, it's time, ***, the man said, his voice distant, as if he were speaking from another world. That I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, with one final breath, I stepped into the void. The sensation was indescribable. It was like being pulled through a black hole, my body stretching and distorting as I passed through the portal. For a moment, I felt nothing, no sound, no light, no sense of time. Just an endless, suffocating darkness, and then, I emerged. The world on the other side of the doorway was wrong. The sky was a sickly, swirling mass of red and black, and the ground beneath me pulsed like a living thing. Twisted, nightmarish shapes moved in the distance, creatures that defied logic or reason. That I wasn't alone. The entities that had been kept in the tanks, the things that had once been human, were here, crawling, slithering across the landscape. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, watching me, waiting. The center of it all was the source, Nexus itself. A massive, pulsating structure, a living doorway that connected this world to mine. And it was growing, feeding on the chaos around it. That I knew what I had to do. That I approached the structure, my body trembling with fear. The closer I got, the more it pulled at me, threatening to tear me apart. But I kept moving, step by step, until I was standing before it. There was no turning back. With a deep breath, I reached out and placed my hand on the surface of the doorway. It was cold, impossibly cold, and as soon as I touched it, a surge of energy shot through me. I could feel the doorway resisting, fighting against me, but I pushed harder, willing it to close. The ground trembled beneath me, and the sky above darkened as the doorway began to shrink, its tendrils retracting. The creatures around me screeched in agony, their forms unraveling as the portal closed, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Nexus was gone. That I woke up in the desert, lying on the cold, hard ground. The facility was gone, nothing but an empty stretch of sand and rock remained. No buildings, no tanks, no doorway. It was as if it had never existed. That I staggered to my feet, my head spinning. The man in the black suit was nowhere to be found, and neither was Susan. But I knew, deep down, that Nexus was truly closed. For now. That I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty desert. But eventually, I turned and walked away. The world had been saved, at least, for the time being. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Nexus wasn't really gone. It was just waiting, and someday, it would open again. The drive back from the desert felt surreal. The silence inside the car was deafening, only broken by the occasional hum of the engine. My mind raced, replaying the events over and over again. I had closed the Nexus, stopped whatever dark force had been unleashed. But the feeling of finality was missing. It wasn't victory that I felt, it was dread. A creeping suspicion that Nexus wasn't truly gone, just buried deeper, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. That a few days passed, and I tried to return to my normal life. The nightmares hadn't stopped. They were worse now, vivid and persistent, pulling me back into that twisted realm every time I closed my eyes. The creatures I had seen on the other side of the portal appeared in my dreams, watching me, their forms slowly warping, becoming more human. The messages didn't stop either. At first, they were small things, calls from unknown numbers that would go silent when I picked up, strange emails with gibberish subject lines. Then, one morning, I woke up to find a note slipped under my door. It was simple, just 2 words ***, keep quiet. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning that I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just paranoia. But deep down, I knew the truth. Nexus had touched me, and there were people out there who wanted to make sure I never talked about what I had seen. They weren't just erasing the project, they were erasing everyone connected to it that I knew I couldn't live like this. Whatever had happened at that facility, whatever I had seen, it wasn't over. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends. What was Nexus really? And why had the government been so desperate to contain it? I began digging into the old files I had saved from my investigation. Harold Mercer's name appeared again and again, along with cryptic references to a larger operation, something called Project Paragon. I had ignored it before, thinking it was just another codename for Nexus, but now, I wasn't so sure that I reached out to some of my old contacts, people who worked in the shadows, who knew how to dig up information the government didn't want anyone to find. One of them, a hacker I had used before, managed to pull up a classified document. It was heavily redacted, but the message was clear ***. Project Paragon was a global initiative. Nexus wasn't the only doorway. There were others, ***. I sat there, staring at the screen, my heart pounding. If Nexus wasn't the only portal, then where were the others? And what had the government really been doing with them? The thought chilled me to the bone. I had barely survived closing one doorway. What if there were others that had already been opened? Worse, what if they couldn't be closed? I kept digging, piecing together fragments of information, slowly uncovering a vast network of secret projects, each tied to different governments and shadow organizations. It became clear that Nexus was part of something much larger, something global, and far beyond my original understanding. Each project was focused on a different doorway, each connected to strange, otherworldly phenomena. The deeper I went, the more dangerous things became. My hacker friend went dark after sending me that last document. His apartment was raided by unidentified agents, and all his equipment had been confiscated. I knew they were closing in on me too, that I had been watching my back ever since that note appeared under my door, but it wasn't enough. One night, I heard footsteps outside my apartment, the quiet scrape of boots on the pavement. I grabbed my gun and stayed low, waiting for the inevitable knock on the door, but it never came. Instead, I heard the sound of a window shattering from the back of the building. They were inside that I bolted for the fire escape, climbing down as quietly as I could. As I reached the alley, I saw the black SUVs pull up, the same ones I had seen before. They had come to make sure I disappeared, just like all the others connected to Nexus that I didn't stick around to see what they planned to do. I knew what my options were: run, or face whatever fate they had in store for me. That I fled the city, disappearing into the vastness of the countryside, staying in motels, using fake names, always moving. But even in hiding, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The nightmares kept getting worse, and no matter how far I ran, I knew I couldn't escape Nexus. It was during one of these restless nights, pulled up in a dingy motel on the outskirts of a small town, that I got another message. This time, it wasn't a note or a call, it was an email from an anonymous account, ***, you're not done yet. There's more you need to see. Attached to the email was a set of coordinates that I hesitated for a long time, staring at the screen. I knew it was a trap, but I also knew I didn't have a choice. Whatever Nexus really was, it had marked me. And the only way to end this nightmare was to follow the trail to the bitter end. The coordinates led me deep into the wilderness, far from any civilization. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was pulling me closer to the truth, and to my inevitable fate. The road became rougher, narrower, until eventually, it disappeared altogether, forcing me to continue on foot. After hours of walking, I reached the location. There was nothing there, just an empty clearing surrounded by trees. But as I stood there, I felt the ground beneath me tremble. The air around me grew thick, almost oppressive, and I knew I wasn't alone. That I walked further into the clearing, my heart pounding, and then I saw it, a small, metallic hatch hidden beneath the dirt. It was old, rusted, but it was unmistakably the entrance to something underground. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle, pulling it open with a groan of metal on metal. A dark stairwell led down into the earth, the air inside cold and damp. Every instinct in my body told me to turn back, to walk away and never look back, but I couldn't. That I descended into the darkness, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. The stairwell seemed to go on forever, spiraling deeper and deeper into the earth. And as I went, I could feel something waiting for me at the bottom, something ancient, something wrong. At the bottom of the stairwell, I found myself standing before a massive door, much like the one I had seen in the Nexus facility. The air around it pulsed with energy, a faint humming sound vibrating through the walls. I could feel the pull again, the same pull I had felt in the facility. The doorway was calling to me. This was it. Another Nexus, but this one was different. It felt stronger, more dangerous. Whatever was on the other side of this doorway wasn't just waiting, it was ready. That I hesitated for a long moment, my hand hovering over the door's surface. I knew that opening it could unleash something far worse than I had ever imagined. But I also knew that if I didn't, the truth would remain hidden, and the doorways would continue to spread, one by one. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. What I saw on the other side was beyond anything I could have prepared for. The world that awaited me was not just a twisted reflection of our own, it was a place of pure chaos, where the laws of physics and reality no longer applied. Creatures moved in the distance, their forms shifting and warping with every step. The sky above was a swirling mass of darkness, punctuated by flashes of strange, alien light. And the center of it all was the source, a massive, pulsating entity, far larger than the Nexus I had seen before. It wasn't just a doorway, it was something alive, something that had been feeding on the worlds it connected. And it saw me. For a moment, I was paralyzed with fear. The entity's eyes, or what passed for eyes, locked onto me, and I could feel its presence in my mind, probing, searching. It wasn't just a creature, it was a god, a being from beyond our understanding. And I had just opened the door to its world. The entity began to move, its massive form shifting and undulating as it reached out toward me. I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake. That I turned and ran, my mind screaming as the entity's presence filled my thoughts, its voice echoing in my skull, ***, you cannot escape. You are mine. I sprinted back up the stairs, the sound of the entity's voice growing louder with every step. The stairwell seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around me as I climbed. That I don't know how I made it out, but somehow, I did. I burst through the hatch, slamming it shut behind me, and collapsed in the dirt, gasping for air. The entity's voice still echoed in my mind, but it was fainter. Now, distant. I had escaped, for now, but I knew it wasn't over. The doorways were still out there, waiting to be opened. And the entity was still watching, waiting for its chance to break through. That I don't know how much longer I have before it finds me again, but I do know one thing, the doorways must be closed, all of them. If they aren't, the entity will break free, and when it does, there will be no stopping it. That I'm not the only one who knows this. There are others out there, people who have seen the doorways, who have felt the pull of the entity. We're all connected now, part of something much larger than ourselves, but we're also running out of time. The entity is growing stronger, and soon, it will find a way through. When it does, the world as we know it will end, and I'll be the one to blame. I sat in my car, shaking, trying to comprehend what had just happened. My lungs burned from running, my heart still pounding from the sheer terror of that thing, ***, the entity ***, inside the Nexus. The entity had spoken to me, touched my mind, and I knew I would never be the same again. Its presence lingered in my thoughts, like a stain I couldn't wash away. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't go back to my apartment. They would find me, and if they didn't, that thing would. I didn't have much time, the weight of what I had just seen crushed down on me. I wasn't equipped to deal with this. This was beyond me, beyond anyone, really. But I had to tell someone. I had to warn them. Maybe it was already too late, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the contacts. Most of my old friends, even my colleagues, were either too afraid to get involved or had already disappeared. But there was one person I hadn't reached out to yet, an old mentor, Robert Michaels, a retired government agent who had helped train me years ago. He was someone who had lived through the darkness, the conspiracies, and survived that. I dialed his number. Each ring felt like an eternity. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the parking lot for any sign of the black SUVs, of men in suits, or worse, any sign of it. Finally, a gruff voice answered. "Who is this?" "It's me," I said, my voice cracking slightly. I need your help." "It's bad, Robert. Really bad." There was a long pause. I could tell he was gauging my tone. "How bad?" They opened a doorway to something else. Something not human. I choked out the words, each one weighed down by the sheer gravity of the truth. "It's real, Robert. And it's coming." Another long pause. I could hear him take a deep breath on the other end. "Meet me at the safe house. Don't be followed." The safe house was an old, dilapidated cabin deep in the woods, a place I hadn't been to in years. I drove through the night, constantly checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights trailing me. The night was thick, oppressive, the sky an endless blanket of black. Every sound outside my car felt like a warning, every shadow like something lurking just out of sight. When I finally arrived, Robert was already there, waiting on the porch with a cigarette in his hand. His face was worn, years of dealing with the worst the world had to offer etched into his features. "What the hell did you get into?" he asked as I stepped out of the car. I told him everything. The Nexus facility, the experiments, the portal, and the entity. His face grew grimmer with every word, but he didn't seem surprised. Instead, he looked resigned. "I knew this day would come," he muttered, grinding out the cigarette under his boot. Robert ushered me inside, where we sat in the dim light of a single lamp. He pulled out an old file, thick and yellowed with age. As he flipped through the pages, I caught glimpses of documents stamped with government seals, black and white photos of strange machinery, and reports with whole sections redacted. "Nexus isn't the first time the government tried to tamper with things they shouldn't," he said, his voice low. "This entity you encountered? It's been around longer than you or I, longer than any of us." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused that he tapped one of the documents. "In the 1940s, during the war, they found something in the Arctic. A doorway, just like the one you described. It wasn't natural, it was built. Someone, or something, created these portals, and our government's been trying to figure out how to control them ever since." "But why?" I asked, leaning forward, feeling the weight of the revelation sinking in. "Power," he said simply. "Imagine being able to harness whatever is on the other side of those doorways. Imagine the military advantage. But it's not just about weapons. There are things over there that defy explanation, knowledge, technology. Some of it can rewrite the very fabric of reality. That's why they kept pushing. Even when the risks were too high. But they failed," I said, remembering the terror in the Nexus. "The entity, they didn't control it. They unleashed it." Robert nodded grimly. "And now it's loose. It'll be looking for a way to expand, to break through completely. And if it does," he didn't need to finish the sentence. I knew what was at stake, everything. Robert stood up and walked over to a hidden compartment in the wall. He pulled out a small black case, one that looked like it had seen its share of battles. He placed it on the table and opened it, revealing an old, worn device. "This is our only shot," he said. It's an EMP of sorts, but modified. It can scramble the energy signatures of those doorways, severing the connection between our world and theirs. Will it work? I asked, unsure that he shrugged. It worked once. In 1977, they tried something similar in Alaska. They shut down one of the portals, but it came at a cost. Everyone involved either disappeared or, well, let's just say they didn't come back right. I swallowed hard. This was it, the last chance to stop whatever I had set in motion. But there's a catch, Robert said, his eyes meeting mine. You have to get close to the portal. Really close. And once it's activated, there's no guarantee you'll make it out. I felt my stomach drop. The entity was still out there, waiting, watching. And I would have to go back into its domain to stop it, but I had no choice. Over the next few days, Robert and I prepared. We gathered what little gear we had, mapped out the route to the Nexus facility, and made contingency plans in case things went sideways, which they almost certainly would. The nightmares continued, worse than ever. The entity's voice echoed in my mind, promising things, threatening me, showing me glimpses of a world beyond our own, one that would consume everything if given the chance. Every night, it grew stronger. Every night, the pull of the doorway became harder to resist. On the morning of the mission, Robert handed me the device. This is it, he said. Once you set this off, there's no turning back. The doorway will collapse, but you need to get out before it does. Otherwise, I nodded. I understand. We loaded up into Robert's old truck and began the long drive back to the Nexus facility. The roads were empty, the world around us quiet, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. As we neared the facility, my heart pounded in my chest. I could feel it, the pull, the presence of the entity growing stronger. It knew I was coming. It was waiting for me. We parked a mile from the facility and approached on foot, moving under the cover of darkness. The building loomed ahead of us, silent and abandoned, but I knew better. The entity was inside, waiting for me to open the doorway again. I gripped the EMP device tightly, my mind racing. This was it, the end game. If we failed, the entity would break free, and the world as we knew it would end. Robert turned to me, his face grim. Ready? I took a deep breath, nodding. Let's do this. And with that, we stepped into the facility, ready to face whatever waited for us on the other side. The Nexus facility was as eerie as ever, but now, it felt worse. The air itself was wrong, too thick, too cold, and charged with a strange static. Every step we took echoed unnaturally through the halls, and I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger the deeper we went. Robert moved ahead of me, his flashlight casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Every corner we turned, every door we opened, felt like stepping closer to something that was waiting for us. The entity was aware of our presence, it had to be. I could sense it in my mind, prodding and pulling, whispering things I didn't want to understand. The doorway was close now, and I could almost feel it pulling me in, like a magnet. We reached the large, metallic door that led to the Nexus chamber, the same one I had seen before, when everything had gone wrong. It was sealed shut, just as I had left it. Robert and I stood there in silence for a moment, the tension thick between us. You sure about this? He asked quietly, his eyes hard but filled with concern. I nodded. There's no other way. He didn't say anything else. He just handed me the EMP device and stepped aside, giving me room to work. My hands were shaking as I set the device down on the floor, hooking up the cables to the panel by the door. The EMP would fry everything inside. Hopefully, it would be enough to sever the connection between our world and the entities. As I connected the final wire, the door let out a low groan, as if it could sense what we were trying to do. The strange hum from the other side grew louder. The doorway was alive. Ready? Robert asked again, his voice tight. Yeah. I took a deep breath. Let's end this. I pressed the button to open the door. It slid open slowly, revealing the same swirling, pulsating light that I had seen before, the portal, the Nexus, the doorway to another reality. But something was different this time. The light was stronger, more vibrant, and the pull was almost unbearable. It felt like it was reaching out to me, wrapping invisible fingers around my body, dragging me forward. That I glanced at Robert. He nodded, his face grim, and we both stepped into the chamber. The air inside was thick with electricity, the hairs on my arms standing on end as we approached the portal. I could feel the entity watching us, waiting, its presence stronger than ever. My thoughts felt clouded, distorted, as if the entity was already invading my mind. That I reached into my bag, pulling out the EMP device. The plan was simple: set the EMP in front of the portal, activate it, and hope it would be enough to shut down the Nexus. But nothing about this felt simple anymore. The weight of what I was about to do settled heavily on my shoulders. "This is it," I whispered, just as I crouched down to set the EMP. The entire facility shook violently. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, like the roar of something massive and ancient. The ground beneath us trembled, and I could feel the entity's presence pushing against the walls of reality. That I froze, my hand hovering over the activation button. The light from the portal flared, blinding and intense, and for a moment, I thought the doorway had already opened fully. The humming grew louder, vibrating through my bones, and then I saw it, the silhouette of something moving on the other side. That it wasn't just a creature, it was the entity itself, trying to push through the doorway. "We need to hurry," Robert yelled, his voice barely audible over the deafening noise. That I slammed the button on the EMP, and the device whirred to life. A high-pitched whine filled the room, and the lights around us flickered. The portal's light dimmed slightly, but it wasn't enough. The entity was still coming through, forcing its way into our world. The EMP wasn't working fast enough. I could see the entity's form more clearly now, a massive, shifting shape of darkness, tendrils of energy reaching out toward us. The air around it distorted, twisting reality in strange and impossible ways. "We need more time," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the chaos. Robert cursed under his breath and pulled out his gun, as if shooting at the thing would make a difference. But it was instinct, and in that moment, I understood. We were up against something far beyond us, something that didn't follow the rules of our world. The EMP was still running, but it wasn't enough. The portal flickered and pulsed, fighting against the energy that was trying to shut it down. And the entity, *it new star. It was aware of our plan, and it wasn't going to let us succeed. With a final, desperate surge of energy, the entity pushed harder, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me. My vision blurred, and I collapsed to my knees, struggling to stay conscious. The portal was overwhelming, its energy was too strong, too powerful. In that moment, I knew we were out of time. The EMP wasn't going to work, not fast enough. The entity was breaking through, and once it fully emerged, there would be no stopping it. Robert grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. His face was set, determined, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew what had to be done. "There's only one way to stop this," he said, his voice strained. "The EMP won't be enough. But if we can overload the portal from this side," I shook my head, not wanting to believe it. "That'll kill us." "It's either that or let it through," Robert said, his voice hard. "I've seen what happens when one of these things breaks free. We can't let it happen." I looked at him, and in that moment, I understood. He was right. There was no other choice. That we worked quickly, reconfiguring the EMP to overload the portal's energy, pushing it beyond its limits. The whole facility shook violently, the walls cracking and groaning as the portal fought back. The light from the Nexus was blinding now, and the entity's form was almost fully visible, massive and grotesque, looming on the other side. "We've got about 30 seconds before this thing blows," Robert said, his voice tight. "We need to get out of here." But as I looked at the portal, I knew it was already too late. The energy was too unstable, the entity too close. We wouldn't make it out in time. Robert seemed to realize it too. He gave me a sad smile, the kind of smile someone gives when they know they're about to die. "It's been a hell of a ride," he said, and then the world exploded in light. That I don't know how I survived. When I woke up, the facility was in ruins. The portal was gone, completely erased, as if it had never been there. The air was still and quiet, and the entity's presence was gone, but Robert wasn't there. I stumbled out of the wreckage, my body battered and bruised, but alive. Somehow, against all odds, we had done it. The portal was closed. The entity was trapped again, cut off from our world, but at what cost? As I limped away from the ruins of the Nexus facility, I realized that this wasn't over. The government had covered up things like this before, and they would do it again. They would bury the truth, erase all evidence, and pretend like none of this had ever happened, but I knew the truth now. There were more doorways, more Nexus projects, more portals to other worlds. And the entity wasn't gone, it was just waiting. Watching that. I don't know how long it will be before someone else opens one of those doorways, but I know one thing for certain: when it happens, we won't be ready, and next time, there might not be anyone left to stop it. The government may cover it up. They may erase all traces of what happened, but I'll remember, and I'll be waiting. As I staggered away from the ruins of the Nexus facility, I felt a strange mixture of relief and despair. The portal was closed, the entity trapped once again, but I was haunted by the weight of the knowledge I now carried. The truth about what lay beyond our reality, about the dangers we were blissfully unaware of, was a burden I could not easily shake off. In the days that followed, I kept a low profile, afraid to attract attention. The government would undoubtedly send agents to sweep the area, to erase any evidence of what had transpired. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows lurked just beyond my vision, and I often found myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see men in black suits, ready to silence me. I contacted a few trusted allies, old friends who had ties to the government. I shared what I knew, hoping to create a network of people who would stand against the darkness that was always lurking, waiting for its chance to escape. They were skeptical, but I could see the flicker of fear in their eyes. They knew that something was amiss. Driven by a need for answers, I began researching the history of the Nexus projects. I discovered numerous reports of similar phenomena throughout history: disappearances, strange occurrences, and failed experiments. Each incident pointed to a web of government secrets intertwined with the supernatural. I documented everything meticulously, knowing that if the government was indeed covering this up, someone needed to tell the world. But who would believe me? The very notion that something otherworldly existed was far-fetched, even for the most open-minded individuals. One night, as I sat in my small apartment surrounded by papers and files, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something told me to answer. "Is this the Investigator?" a gravelly voice asked. "Who is this?" I replied, my heart racing. "You know what you uncovered. We need to meet." "What do you mean?" I pressed. "What do you know? They're coming for you. And they're coming for others, too. You have to be ready." Before I could respond, the call dropped. My pulse quickened as I realized that whoever this was knew about the Nexus and the entity. I couldn't afford to be careless. I took every precaution, bolting doors, covering windows, and staying out of sight. But even in the safety of my home, I felt the eyes of something unseen upon me. The nightmares returned, visions of the entity creeping into my dreams, whispering promises and threats. I knew that my life would never be normal again. I had seen things that could shatter the very fabric of reality. After a week of hiding, I made a decision. I would not live in fear. I would not be a prisoner in my own life. If the government was going to come for me, then they would have to confront me head-on. I would take the fight to them. I started gathering evidence, compiling my research into a cohesive narrative. I found a few journalists who had an interest in uncovering the truth. I shared everything I had with them, knowing that if the story broke, it could cause enough of a stir to draw attention to the horrors lurking behind closed doors. But deep down, I knew the risks. The government had the power to bury the truth, to erase anyone who threatened their secrets. As I stood at the edge of a new chapter in my life, staring into the darkness that loomed ahead, I felt a strange sense of calm. I was no longer just a private investigator. I was now a guardian of a truth that needed to be exposed. The entity may have been sealed away for now, but the doorways would always exist. And I would be ready for when they inevitably opened again. As I took a deep breath and stepped into the night, I vowed to uncover the hidden realities of our world. The fight was far from over, and I was determined to stand against the darkness. That I might not be able to stop what was coming, but I could prepare, and when the time came, I would not be alone.